Every consumer leaves a trail of information from past transactions that can follow them wherever they go. This trail starts as soon as you start earning a paycheck or taking out student loans. It shows when you have a utility bill or lease in your name and when you pay on time or late. Phone bills, credit card statements, car payments, and monthly bills, they all leave a mark. And where you go to see all this information is called a credit report. A credit report contains information on where you live, how you pay your bills, and whether you have been sued, arrested, or filed for bankruptcy. Consumer reporting companies sell the information in your report to creditors, insurers, employers, and other businesses that use it to evaluate your applications for credit, insurance, employment, or renting an apartment. The 3 nationwide consumer credit reporting agencies are Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. You should regularly review your credit report to make sure the information is accurate, complete, and up to date, because the information it contains may affect your applications and/or costs for loans, credit, insurance, employment, or renting a home. You are entitled to review your credit report with each of the 3 agencies for free once a year. There are 3 authorized ways to order: online at www.annualcreditreport.com, by calling 877-322-8228, or by completing and submitting an annual credit report request form. Forms can be printed from www.ftc.gov/credit. Do not contact the agencies individually for your free credit report. Reviewing your credit report can help guard against identity theft. Identity theft is when someone uses your personal information like your name, your social security number, or your credit card number to commit fraud. Identity thieves may use your information to open a new credit card account in your name. When they do not pay the bills, the delinquent account is reported on your credit report. Inaccurate information like that could affect your ability to get credit, insurance, or even a job. If you experience a theft of your personally identifiable information, you may want to put a credit freeze, also known as a security freeze, on your accounts with the credit agencies. A security freeze can help protect against identity theft by prohibiting the release of any information on the credit report without express authorization, except to those with whom you have an existing account or a collection agency acting on behalf of the existing account. The security freeze is designed to prevent an extension of credit, such as a loan or a new credit card, from being approved without consent. When you request a security freeze for your credit report, you will be provided a personal identification number, PIN, to use if you choose to remove the security freeze or authorize the release of your credit report for a specific period of time. Understanding the basics of the loans or credits you take will give you an advantage in keeping your PII secure and making healthy financial decisions in your future. Many resources are available on datcp.wi.gov in the Identity Theft Fact Sheets to assist you in securing your financial identity. Enroll in Consumer Protection 101 by subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us on social media.